Hey everyone, welcome to No Plan, No Problem, a D&D podcast where each week two Dungeon Masters take a deep dive into a different topic, explore some perspectives and try and find 3 actionable tips for you to use in your next game. I'm your Dungeon Master Anto.
And I'm just your dungeon, Matthew Perkins.
You can find me across the internet at Icarus Games, and that's icarus-games.co.uk.
And you can find my stuff over at matthewperkins.net.
So today we're going to be talking about megadungeons. Now, I would argue that in a lot of ways, a megadungeon is kind of the most quintessential D&D thing that there is. A lot of people, when they think of D&D, they think of delving into dungeons and kicking down doors and fighting monsters. And in a lot of ways, that's all a megadungeon is a lot of the time. So we're going to be diving into the mega dungeon today.
Okay, that sounds pretty exciting. We're not physically going into the mega dungeon. We're figuratively.
No, going into a mega dungeon would be absolutely horrific, and we'll probably get into why. But we're gonna figuratively delve into the dungeon today.
Okay, thank you. You got to be specific with this kind of stuff. Hey, Anto, who's helping us with our first tip today on mega dungeons?
So to help us find our first tip today, we're looking at a question posed by Captain Mycroft over on the Matthew Colville subreddit. And he says, I can't seem to get a solid answer as to how physically large a mega dungeon should be. A mega dungeon should last a campaign, sure, but how does that translate to room numbers, square feet, encounter sizes? It's been difficult to grasp how large of a framework I need to work in to make this dungeon feel big.
Ooh. How big should the mega dungeon be? Like, how big should your boat be?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a pretty cool question. I like that because there's a lot of conceptual stuff in there. Does a mega dungeon even need a size? If the definition is just, this dungeon needs to be big enough that our whole campaign takes place in or around this dungeon, does it matter what size it is? You know, maybe it's like Minecraft where it's a procedurally generated kind of story. Maybe it doesn't have borders. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. And I think that is a really good way to at least start thinking about how you want your mega dungeon to be. Because with a mega dungeon, the whole point is your entire campaign is this dungeon. You know, you don't have a wider world around it that you're going to go and explore. You've all signed up as players to delve this dungeon, and that is the game. You're going to be underground in this dungeon. So it needs to be as big as it needs to be to sustain your campaign. If you decide that you want to play next week, the dungeon is going to be a little bit bigger. If you want to end your campaign, you find the end of the dungeon.
Well, even then, I would say, like, did the players really solve this dungeon, or did they solve their purpose in the dungeon? Because I'd like to think that it's got the word mega in it. That's one of the bigger words, Anto. It didn't say the large dungeon. It didn't say the huge dungeon. It said mega dungeon, my dude. That's big.
I think that one way to kind of look at it is I would approach a mega dungeon as being kind of generations of dungeon, like sitting on top of each other. So something that I have always found strange with mega dungeons is you go down there and there's this whole massive like ecology down there, and it can be kind of difficult to explain that away. So I like to approach it with this generational viewpoint where you've got dungeons built on top of dungeons, or maybe entire cities down there.
Okay, so it's like a space that's been co-opted by a bunch of different agendas, and the story emerges from the way those agendas overlap, intersect, and bounce off each other.
Yeah.
Like there's natural conflict in those conflicting ecologies. That's pretty cool, man. You have just kind of like made my heart swell a little bit for mega dungeons. Because what that makes me think of a mega dungeons is it's more of a setting and less of a dungeon. It's not saying, hey, our story is we're going to go kick down the doors in this dungeon. It's like, no. Our setting is this dungeon and we're going to tell a story in this setting.
Yeah, the mega dungeon is the setting, and I think as the Dungeon Master you want to approach it as such and give it kind of all the care and attention in terms of world building that you would give to a wider world.
But even then, when you're world building, I'm presuming here, but I'm presuming that when you world build, just like I do, that you mainly try and prep or think of the things that are actually going to influence your game. So when it comes to the question of how big is a mega dungeon, the answer is maybe somewhere along the lines of like, as big as you think you will cover in your game? Is that, I don't even know if that's helpful though. Is that a little bit flippant?
If I were to search for a specific tip, like an actionable tip, like the whole point of this podcast is supposed to be, what I would go with is, in terms of size, the Mega Dungeon needs to feel infinite, but you only ever present a slice. So your players get in there, they only need to know about the immediate area around them, and then feel as if there is a much larger dungeon beyond that.
So you're preaching lies, Anto. You're saying lie to your players.
That's absolutely what I'm saying. I'm saying when they get in, as an example, if you were going to map it, and I'm not necessarily sure I advocate for mapping a Mega Dungeon, but if you were going to map it, only hand them the map of their immediate surroundings. So either the level that they're on or the area of the level that they're on, and then allude to the wider world so that you give yourself the space to make up anything that you need to beyond what they can see.
Yeah. And that's so cool because it means that the kind of plot hooks that you're dropping, if they don't run into the conclusion of those plot hooks or the actual juice to the point where they can really chase down that story, if you say, hey, this goblin has a totem on him of this ancient god you've never heard of, if they never run into that again, you have like complete authority to say, well, it's deeper in the dungeon. You guys didn't explore that bit.
Exactly. Anytime you forget something and they say, oh, well, didn't we come across X or Y or Z, you've always got the, well, it's deeper in the dungeon.
Look, but you say that you might not necessarily need a map to map out the Mega Dungeon, but the Wizards of the Coast, who are the only true real wizards in the world, they released a book called Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is a Mega Dungeon. That's what it's advertised as, and that's what it is, I believe. And it's 20 layers of a dungeon, all bloody excruciatingly mapped out to the finest, silliest, stupidest details. And that, I guess that's like wizards prescribing that you might need a map, but you're saying that you could ignore that.
A map only exists to kind of give the players a sense of relative positioning, and for that, you don't need a grid map, you don't need anything fancy. You can just have a piece of paper that shows the relative position between them and whatever it is they're trying to do. A Mega Dungeon is supposed to feel huge, and as soon as you put something into a map, you are putting a limit on it. You are putting a boundary, the edge of the page on it. So don't use a map, and if the players want a map, have them map it out.
And the reason for that is because the dungeon only needs to be as big as your story needs it to be, right?
Exactly.
So it's infinite. It's infinite as long as it's bigger than the boundary of your story. What's our first tip down? Should we roll for sponsorship?
Let's do it.
Because we are a little fledgling podcast, we don't have those proper sponsors giving us those proper dollars. So instead, we're just giving these shout outs to our good friends over at YouTube. Not YouTube, the company. They're not our friends. They're our enemies. But our good friends, Bob, World Builder, he's got a lovely YouTube channel where he does some D&D advice, much like this, except he has a great series that focuses on the Dragon of Icespire Peak, and that's the D&D Essentials kit. I truly encourage you to go check that out. Bob is a lovely speaker. He's got great graphics, great energy, and he's kind of like the Bob Ross of D&D YouTube. Please go give him a like and a follow and a subscribe and a comment and all the other good YouTube juice.
And you can also support us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a whole bunch of exclusive content like pre-shows and our pilot episode and a whole bunch of other goodies. So head over there to help us keep doing what we do.
Okay, on to the quest for our second tip, and the adventurer helping us with this tip is going to be Candy, Bob and Dandy from RPG Horror Stories, and they're coming at us with a spooky, spooky Mega Dungeon horror story. Our quest starts in a small town, and we learn that some of the villagers hadn't returned yet. We arrive at the dungeon and find a map. My god, it's huge. There are hundreds of rooms. It takes us 3 6-hour sessions to find the villagers. Nearly every room has some sort of random combat encounter. They're almost always skeletons or lesser goblins. After finding the villagers, we learn that one of them is missing. Another 2 sessions with 30 rooms or so, all with random combat encounters later, we meet the goblin leader. One long boss fight later, we enter the basement of the castle. I'm feeling relieved, thinking we'll just fight the wizard and then we can all return to town and do some role-playing. We find a map of the basement. My heart sank. I almost cried. There are hundreds of rooms. We were at level 2 when we started the campaign. We're still at level 2. This is the only campaign I've ever played that I can truly say is boring. One of our players has fallen asleep while we were playing several times. It's just a lot of empty, meaningless dice rolls to get to the good moments. Oh my god, that's tragic.
It is tragic. I actually can really empathize with this person because I've only just remembered this. I must have blanked it from my brain, but I've actually played kind of a mega dungeon game that I really enjoyed, but we had a huge party, and I remember one of the players falling asleep during that as well. I think mega dungeons have this higher than average chance to put players to sleep, it seems.
Yeah, damn. I don't fall asleep ever. I've never slept. So mega dungeons are boring. That's what this guy's coming away with. And I suppose at their worst, they can be.
Yeah.
Right? That is definitely a threat. And I bet that's a lot of people's experience. Were you in that dungeon where someone fell asleep? Were you bored ever?
I don't have any memories of being bored. It's been a long time, so obviously, your brain kind of skims off the bad stuff. But I don't remember being particularly bored. But I know that kind of this problem of, we're just in random encounter after random encounter in the same kind of walled room is a real danger when it comes to mega dungeons. Okay,
because it kind of transforms a role-playing game into feeling more like a war game, kind of like Warhammer, the miniatures, or any kind of game that you're counting hexes and rolling dice and not really describing much.
Yeah, it's. I think it's much closer to really old school original D&D than you're likely to find in most games nowadays, because the game started as kind of a pieced together system of different war games. So I understand why there are still a subsection of players today that absolutely love that kick down the door, find what random monster is in it, kill it, and take its treasure play. But for a lot of newer players, especially, it seems, we tend to want more of the narrative, story-driven stuff. And I think a lot of people do struggle with how to kind of make the dungeon or the mega dungeon feel less stale.
Now, you'd think that rolling random dice would be exciting, but when you are playing as a player, I don't know how often you do play as a player, but when you're a player and your characters and party enter a room in a dungeon and you see the DM rolling dice and you think that, they're rolling to see if there's an encounter in here, are you excited by that? Or are you not excited by that?
I don't think I've ever been excited by a random encounter, either as a player or a DM.
Okay, that's my feeling as well.
I come to D&D primarily for the story. I do enjoy a good combat, but I want everything to kind of have some kind of story behind it. And it doesn't have to have, the big overarching plot behind it, but I want everything to feel like it has a place in the world. And for me, rolling kind of random encounters takes a bit of that away, because you're not putting kind of world context onto the encounter. You're just saying, this random thing lives in this room and we've got no idea why, but you're going to fight it and then move on.
Yeah, my fun in a D&D game as a player is a little engine that runs and burns the fuel of that narrative energy. You feed me story, I'm going to burn it up and I'm just going to spit out fun fumes or something. I don't know. There's a metaphor in here somewhere. I suppose the real way in a mega dungeon context to make those random encounters, even if they are random, feel like they're important, not necessarily to the plot, but at least important enough to garner the player's attention, is to tie every random encounter back into that overall ecology that we were talking about, of the dungeon, like the different factions that might have settled in there. Because it's not going to be one kind of harmonious society in there, right? There's going to be the bandits, there's going to be the goblins, there's going to be the bugbears, and the fun conflict comes from the fact that, how do all these factions interact?
Exactly. The real juice of a mega dungeon comes from the diversity that you can find inside such a relatively small space. And as just a general tip outside of mega dungeons, I think if you're going to use random encounters, you should curate your list. So yes, you can have a table of potential encounters, but make sure that every entry on that encounter table has some kind of meaningful connection to the world that you're playing in or to the story that you're trying to tell.
Now, I have been called out on this before. See, I tend to use the term random encounters as a combat encounter, right? But what I think of random encounters is the wandering monster.
Yes.
So when I say random encounter, I mean wandering monster.
Yeah, I think that a random encounter doesn't have to be a combat encounter, but for 90% of people, I don't have any scientific data for that. But for 90% of people, a random encounter means combat. So I understand why people like Candy, Bob, and Dandy feel bored in these kind of situations, because you've just got room after room of really meaningless monsters. They mention about meeting a goblin leader and just doing that fight, but it doesn't seem like, even though that was a boss fight, it had any bearing on the things that they were supposed to do.
It sounds actually like Candy, Bob, and Dandy. I got the name right. Hey, I'm just going to call you Candy Bob from now. It sounds like Candy Bob, they didn't actually expect this campaign to all be set in the Mega Dungeon.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like they were going, okay, yeah, but when are we going to go to the town? And the DM's probably thinking, well, I didn't prep a town. We're in a dungeon. I prepped the dungeon.
I think that is almost certainly the case. And as with all things, not just in D&D, but in life, communication is key. And if you want to run a Mega Dungeon campaign, make sure the players realize that you're running a Mega Dungeon campaign and that they're not just about to go into what they think is a small dungeon and then pop back to the tavern for some pub lunch.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not our tip. I think that our tip should be the thing that you suggested earlier, which was to curate your random tables and your random instincts to be able to tell some kind of overarching narrative, not even necessarily the game's narrative, but just something that's going to inform the ecology of the system, of the dungeon that they're in, or any kind of world building, because this dungeon is your world. Use your encounters to build that world.
Exactly. Everything that you put in front of the players should be meaningful, even if they don't understand that it's meaningful at that moment.
So the third adventurer helping us with this tip is the fellow. The fellow comes from the forums over at D&D Beyond, and they ask how to handle when players want to leave the dungeon ? If for a reason they want to have to go back to the surface, but they are 13 levels beneath the earth, how do you do it? And when they want to go back right to 13th floor, do you allow it ? That's a good question, fellow. What do you think, Anto?
No, I think that is a great question, and it kind of leads into the horror story element, in that if a Mega Dungeon isn't executed well, then the players just want to leave, and it's not always super apparent on how they get out.
Maybe why would somebody want to leave? Okay, let's say that, except that the players are bored and they don't want to play in this campaign anymore. Why would a player want to leave a Mega Dungeon, do you think?
So I can think of a couple different reasons. There's kind of like a few mechanical reasons and then more narrative reasons. So mechanically, they might want to resupply. So they might be running low on potions or ammunition and that kind of stuff. And they want to go back to the town to stock up. Or they want to go back to the town to sell the stuff that they've got and buy new stuff. And then for narrative reasons, it could be that they're longing for some kind of interaction that they're not getting out of the Mega Dungeon. So they might just want to go to the tavern and spend an evening relaxing where they don't have to worry about a random encounter.
Okay. We can solve those. Do you know why? Because we're super clever. We're so smart. Okay, so what we can do is we can say, if the players want to leave for reasons of resupplying, why can't you put a shop or some kind of hub to resupply in the Mega Dungeon? And by the same token, if you see your players are getting that battle fatigue, if they're getting shell-shocked by all the random encounters that you're throwing at them, you just need to throw in some kind of clearly friendly interaction with them. Though now I'm thinking about it, if the players are kicking down every door, some of those social interactions might end up turning into combat encounters.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of the players get what they put out into the world. But I think that this kind of feeling comes down to the Dungeon Master not exploring the full range of possibilities that you get from a Mega Dungeon. So if you just view it as combat encounter after combat encounter, room after room to be kicked down, then yeah, your players are probably going to get a bit fatigued from that. But if you view it more as its own world and its own setting, and you put different factions who have complex relationships with each other, and put different NPCs who have goals down there that aren't murder, then you're going to give your players the chance for much more engaging and much more varied interactions with the things in the Mega Dungeon.
One option, I reckon, for like putting some social encounters down there is how about like a different party that's also in the dungeon?
Yeah.
And so like, you know how like when you play some video games and you meet NPCs repeated times and they're clearly like, I'm thinking Dark Souls, that kind of game, where you see the same NPCs popping up over and over again and they're clearly on their own parallel or tangential journey and they kind of keep intersecting. That is the way I would approach a mega dungeon. As you encounter them more and more times, they're getting more and more powerful.
Yes.
Maybe you can even like track them through the dungeons. Like you enter a room, hey, this room's already been cleared. Your friend Zegalius has already done it. Remember Zegalius, the knight in the big stupid red armor? And you just kind of paint these parallel storylines. It's a mega dungeon. There's got to be multiple stories happening there, right?
Exactly. And I love the kind of rival party. I think you can get so much juice from that as a dungeon master. And one of the ways that I like to use it is have the rival party hired to do the same thing as the players. Yeah. So if the players are in the mega dungeon to achieve a goal, have the rival party be actively pursuing that same goal, because only one of them can win.
Well, here's the thing. I think from hearing you speak and the tone in your voice just now, I bet that you're planning to say that rival party, they are dicks about it. They're really antagonistic, or like they're not necessarily friendly, but if I were doing it, I would make that rival party like compatriots of the party. They would be like so gracious and be like, hey, we're in this together. You know, maybe the best man win. Because I love that cooperation energy. Was I right in my assumption of you?
Partially.
Okay.
the rival party that I incorporate in my game and that I would probably drop into a mega dungeon has an antagonistic element, but that antagonism comes from them pursuing the same goal and kind of stealing the glory from the players. So maybe the players had been tasked to go down and recover a certain number of items, let's say. They get to the first item and find the box that it's supposed to be in empty, and then they realise that the other party's gotten there first and they're on their way to the second one.
Hey, you weren't hoping to get this box, were you? I hope that your crappy little party wasn't hoping to get what's in this box. Oh, what's this? I've got it over here. It's in my hands. We're the better party.
It's not necessarily so much that the rival party are being mean to the group. It's more that they're just consider themselves better and more professional, and it's a case of, oh well, it's unfortunate that we got here first, but someone's got to get here first.
Dude, now I am literally picturing a SWAT team. Like they've all got like the comms, and it's like they're all suited up. I'm picturing like Blade 2, like that vampire SWAT team that goes into the sewers. They've all got names. Hey, Rogue, come up here. Oh man, Rogue's a class. I can't use Rogue. Hey, Heimerdinger. That's a League of Legends character. You know what? This bit is over. Cancel this bit. But then what's the answer to the question, Anto, of how do you leave a dungeon, a mega dungeon, and how do you get back? I guess the answer is you don't and you don't.
Potentially, you don't and you don't. I think that if I was running a mega dungeon and the players wanted to leave, then if they followed the route that they had come in, I would probably just let them leave without any real drama and be like, okay, you've just come through that path and cleared it, so you can go back out the way you came. But if you want to come back here again, then this path has been empty for a period of time because you've left and gone off and do other things. You will have to fight your way back against new obstacles that have kind of come into the power vacuum that's been left by you wading through these 13 floors.
But that feels kind of like you're punishing them a little bit. Like if they want to leave and they want to come back, you're going, no, well, that's going to make your life harder. Like if you don't want them to leave, you just guilt trip them. Like, oh, come on, guys, you just got here. You're going so soon. But look, everything's laid out. I've got the map. Come on, don't you want to play in this dungeon? Play in my dungeon. Come on.
Yeah. The other option is to kind of hand wave it I'm broken from that voice.
Okay.
But the other option is to kind of hand wave it and say, give them an out. So you could put like a secret tunnel, or maybe some kind of old clockworky elevator kind of contraption that brings them up into the basement of the weird eclectic shop in town. Give them a way to kind of get back to where they were, but that's the only place they can go from. So they have to go from and to a specific point, but it does allow them to kind of get in and out a little easier than it otherwise would have.
Yeah, dude. I think that's actually it, because that's classic video game Dark Souls thing. It's like, no, now you've got the rusty key, so you can unlock this old elevator. And if they go, isn't this kind of stupid? Like, why is this doesn't really make any sense, Dungeon Master? You'd be like, hey, do you want to be trapped in this dungeon forever? No? Then shut up, use the key. Okay? say thank you.
I mean, yes, but you can also incorporate it in more nuanced ways than that. You know, a lot of dungeons have kind of that deep delving vibe to them. So it's very unlikely that your player group are the first group to try and go down there. So what's to say like a mining company hasn't set up kind of like a mining shaft to go and try and get something out of this mega dungeon in the past, and for whatever reason that is now out of commission and the players are able to get it working, and then they control this route into and out of the dungeon to this point. You know, you want to make them work for it, but you don't want to just roadblock them and be like, you're not having fun, you want to leave this dungeon. No, you will all die here.
Well, I suppose if you were running a mega dungeon in a way where the mega dungeon wasn't the whole campaign, like it was just like a side kind of fun house, you would definitely want a way for them to get out.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what? Okay, I really like this. So what? But I don't know how to contextualize this in terms of words and syntax and sentences. What's the tip then?
I would say that the tip is work in ways to leave the dungeon that fit into kind of the world that you're establishing. So think about in-universe ways that people would circumvent multiple levels. So things like elevators and mine shafts, teleportation portals, all those kind of in-universe stuff to get out of the dungeon at set points so that they have to come back to that same point.
Okay, that is a very good tip. And can I add and twist a little bit of that? Can I add the caveats of if the point of your whole campaign isn't that it's meant to be set in a mega dungeon?
Yes.
Because if the point of your whole campaign is it's meant to be set in the mega dungeon, what your players are telling you is that they don't enjoy the campaign, in which case you should talk to your friends.
Yes.
But I really like that idea. And you can also say that the mega dungeon isn't necessarily like a cave, right? A mega dungeon can be anything. The mega dungeon could be a city. The mega dungeon could be a castle. It could be a big library. You know, it can be take any shape, and it probably changes shape the further you go down, like Diablo or something. I
am wholly on board with like a mega dungeon being multiple cities that have been built and built and built on top of each other in kind of the way that we rediscover cities from the ancient period in modern day. I love the idea of a mega dungeon just being multiple layers of these huge cities, and you might even just find like massive caverns with actual buildings and like even quite big buildings and just like an actual city underground.
Isn't it like a complete baller move, like to build a city on another city? Hello everybody, welcome to New Paris. This is built on Old Cardiff. Screw those guys.
We just dumped billions of tons of earth on it and now we've built over it because we could.
Have you guys noticed that the French are lowering a city slowly onto Cardiff? Is anyone going to stop them?
I like that because that implies that the whole city is built and they're just kind of like helicoptering it in, and they must have like huge French flags because people are noting that it is the French.
I don't know where Cardiff is. Is that Wales? No,
it is Wales. It's the capital of Wales.
Look at us. We're best friends. Hey, we did a podcast.
We did do a podcast. Well done, us. Well done, you, for listening.
Thank you. Oh, wait, you weren't congratulating me.
Yeah, no, I meant the listener, but well done to you too. You can get gold star.
Thank you. What are the tips?
So, to round off, our tips. Tip number 1 was don't feel like you have to use a map. You know, and if you do use a map, the map only needs to be as big as the story needs it to be. So You only need to put enough of a map in front of your players to get them through the next session. Tip number 2 was to kind of curate your random elements so they are more tied to the overall story or the overall theme of your game, and they're less just like random monster in room 17B. And then tip number 3 was to add in-universe ways to get right back up to the surface if your mega dungeon isn't the whole campaign. And then if your mega dungeon is the whole campaign and your players want to leave, talk to your players because maybe they don't want to play in a mega dungeon.
I am not convinced that you're not an AI. How do you remember all that? It's crazy. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for listening. My name is Matthew Perkins. You can find my stuff over at matthewperkins.net.
And my name is Anto, and you can find my stuff at icarus-games.co.uk.
The song that plays us out is called All Together by a band called House Hats. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.
I'm all right.
No problem.